His books almost always turn out to be bestsellers. Among them, The Professor and the Madman, Atlantic, The Man Who Loved China, A Crack in the Edge of the World, and Krakatoa. In 2006, he was made an Officer of the Order of the British Empire by Her Majesty the Queen. His newest book, extraordinary work, The Men Who United the States, published last year. Please welcome Simon Winchester.
First thing I want to say before I introduce the panel of very distinguished people is to cheer us up about biography as a genre. I wrote a book about 5 years ago about the Atlantic Ocean, and my idea was to call it Atlantic, the Biography of an Ocean. But my publishers were told by the buyer from Borders that the word biography was death to anyone's hopes of being a bestseller. So they, at Borders, insisted the book's title be changed to, and I forget it so long, Atlantic, Great Sea Battles, Heroic Discoveries, Titanic Storms, Ocean of a Million Stories. You certainly can, and it isn't on. I've completely forgotten, and that story therefore is ruined. The point I was trying to make anyway is that Borders said that biography is dead, but the fact of the matter is that biography lives and Borders is dead. Well, we shouldn't exult in the death of any bookstore, however vulgar Borders may have been. The three eminent people that are joining me this evening to discuss biography and history, how these two genres intersect, are, in the far corner, Brenda Wineapple, who has written books on, initially, I think, your first, Janet Flanner, extraordinary correspondent for The New Yorker. She wrote for many years under the pen name Genet. And then you wrote on the relationship between Gertrude and Leo Stein, Leo being her brother, I believe. Is that and then Nathaniel Hawthorne, and then another relationship story, as it were, Emily Dickinson and the marvelously named Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Have I got that right? We'll talk about your new book in a second, because that's what I want you to be discursive about. David Nasaw, in the middle, writes, is a historian. You're a professor of history, I think, are you not? So amply placed to discuss the intersection of these two genres. And you write big biographies about big and famous men. William Randolph Hearst. Most recently, well, I should say the middle one, Andrew Carnegie, great steel baron and philanthropist. And most recently, Joseph Kennedy, much loathed in Britain still. And I'm sure we'll explain about that when he was ambassador in London and said some nasty things about the British. And then Amanda Vaill, immediately on my left, who wrote about, initially, I think, two stunningly romantic members of the famous or infamous Lost Generation in Paris, Gerald and Sarah Murphy, the choreographer Jerome Robbins, and most recently, which is what I'll ask you to talk about in just a few moments, the famous great hotel, now I believe a department store, in Madrid, which I would call the Hotel Florida, which I think is actually probably pronounced the Hotel Florida.
You are correct.
Am I
Florida
correct?
is actually Spanish. But
right, exactly. So the Hotel Florida. The thing about Brenda and Amanda's books, which makes them so very different from David's, is that they have all been writing history. I mean, what is biography? It's novels are how we are, and biography is how we got to where we are. So all of these stories tell, to a lesser or greater extent and through different prisms, how we got to where we are. Only the difference between the two most recent books of Amanda with Hotel Florida and Brenda with Ecstatic Nation, a portrait of the United States between 1848 and 1877, I believe, tell the stories of a period of history through much shorter and more discrete portraits of the principal figures that passed through those years or that place. Whereas David, in a way, writes more conventional blockbuster biographies. And I'm going to ask the two of you ladies, first of all, and you first of all, Amanda, tell me how you approached telling a portrait of Madrid at the time of the Spanish Civil War through a structure and through the people who inhabited that structure.
Well, I actually, this book began its life with a quotation from Ernest Hemingway, who is one of the figures in it. And he said, and I will have to paraphrase this because I have it right here. Hold the phone, I can read to you. He said in a letter which he had written to the Theater Guild as a kind of publicity piece for a play he had written about the Spanish Civil War in Madrid called The Fifth Column, he wrote, "You could learn as much at the Hotel Florida in those years as you could learn anywhere in the world." And when I read this line, I thought, that's a book. And it was. He also listed all the people who had come through the hotel at this time that he was in it. And they were people like Robert Capa and Hemingway himself and Martha Gellhorn and John Dos Passos. And I thought to my Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And I just thought this was definitely a story that I should tell. And that the hotel itself became a sort of a metaphor for Spain in the years from 1936 to 1939, when a desperate war was going on for the fate of the country. The right-wing generals had revolted. Francisco Franco was at their head, and they wanted to overthrow the democratically elected left-wing socialist government. And a lot of intellectuals flocked to Spain to try to observe, influence, interpret what was going on there. And this became a fascinating idea to me. What happens when an event like this happens and all of these outsiders come flocking in and want to get involved? And then what happens to the people, the Spanish people, the people for whom this war is actually a reality they can never escape from? Everybody else can go home. These people can't go home. Or if they might have to leave the country and never see it again, but that's their home. So to me, the contrast between all of these different destinies became the story that I wanted to tell.
All of the people that you wrote about, and this is a question, although put as a statement, are non-Spanish.
No, well, actually, one of the people who was a principal, I wrote about 6 principal people, 3 couples, because this is also, oddly, a love story, or a tripartite love story. One of the couples was Arturo Barea, who was the chief censor, which is to say he was the head of the government's press office in Madrid during this period. And it was his job, in part, to interpret what was happening to all these foreigners who were coming through, to help them tell the story of what was going on. And he himself was instrumental in trying not to just spoon feed to them communiques that were propaganda, but to allow the real truth to come out. And this got him in terrible trouble with some of the hardliners in the government who did not like this. And in the end, he and the woman that he fell in love with, who was an Austrian who had come to Spain to throw in her lot with the government's cause, they fled Spain, sort of just in front of, on the one hand, Stalinist secret police, and on the other hand, Franco's forces, and got out to first Paris and then London.
So a portrait then of the Spanish Civil War told through the lives, mini biographies, if you like, of half a dozen people. Brenda, 1848, 1877, tumultuous period in American history, told through...
Nothing much happens.
Nothing too much happens.
Just a civil war, reconstruction, dividing the country. Little things like that, in 14th, 15th, 13th, 14th, 15th.
Now, did you look at it as a period or as a collection of people?
It was not a collection of people. It's not a collection of people. Just a word back to Amanda's book, which I had the great pleasure of reading. I would agree with the assessment you're making, and I think Amanda's agreeing too, that it's a group biography where the central conceit, if you will, is Hotel Florida. I mean, is where these people come through. And as a consequence of that conceit in those three couples, you, at least I, got from Amanda a very cogent sense of what the complications of that war, the Spanish Civil War, were about. You know, seriously, because it's a very difficult war in that there were factions really fighting at cross purposes to one another, and I think Amanda, as a corollary, I don't know if it was your first intention, certainly brought that forward through the lives of these people, but the lives of these people were front and center. So I think of it as a group biography. The book that I just did was conceived of as history, nonfiction narrative history, pure and simple. The fact that there are so-called characters in it, well, of course. I mean, you can't tell a story about the very, difficult period of 30 years in America where the country really redefined itself without bringing forward people that you're familiar with, whether it's Grant or Lincoln or Stephen Douglas or Susan B. Anthony, but also at the same time people you may not be familiar with, William Parker, a fugitive slave who became kind of freedom fighter and so forth and so on. But to my mind, this was not biography. There are many people who may be on and off the so-called stage very, very quickly. You don't get their background, who they are, and you don't necessarily find out where they're going. This is a kind of more, I think it's, when David will tell us, a term that's out of fashion, much more intellectual history or much more political history in that sense. But the interesting thing to me is that the book you mentioned that I did before this one, it's about the relationship between Emily Dickinson and a person who was an abolitionist as well as writer and editor, Thomas Wentworth Higginson. In the very introduction of that book, or the prologue, I don't remember what I called it now, I said this is not a biography of Emily Dickinson, about whom biography gets us nowhere, and I still believe that. And then I said, nor is it a biography of Thomas Wentworth Higginson for other kinds of reasons. Rather, it's a story of their relationship. So I never saw that book as a biography, although I can understand where and why others would. But, and probably we'll have a discussion of where history and biography overlap and where they don't. But I certainly didn't see my recent book at all. But then, of course, I didn't see my other book that way either, and I guess the writer knows least of all how people are going to categorize her book.
Well, this seems a very nicely chosen spectrum then. Here we have history written as a series of condensed biographies, if you like, history written where the biographies appear almost coincidentally against the background of turmoil. And then we have David, who is, as I mentioned...
Then we have David.
Now, you're the man. Do you think...
No, the man was two panels ago.
That's funny.
How legitimate are these techniques compared to the, if I may say so without seeming in any sense condescending, the conventional technique that you employ?
I think that I don't take offense at the word, but I don't consider myself a biographer and have never considered myself a biographer. I'm a historian, and I write my history in different ways. I mean, there is no one style of history. Right. I say it again, I'm a historian, and I write biography as a way in. I think the three of you are historians. I don't think you can write good, or what I consider good biography, without being a historian. I said that a couple of times I mean, I've said that a lot, and people look at me with raised eyebrows. And then Arnold Rampersad gave a keynote talk here. You invited him, right? About 3 years ago?
About 3 years ago.
And he stood up and he said, you know, all biography is history. He said, and any biographer who attempts to write a biography without understanding history or without an attempt to write history is not going to write something that I, Arnold Rampersad, think is worth reading. Arnold is not a historian.
But given that
Literary.
it's the oldest cliche in the book, that all biography is fiction, does that mean all history is fiction?
You know, I wish Jay's not here anymore.
Yeah.
One of the things that convinced me that biography is a subgenre of history was that Jay repeated, and Susan and Jay and Dorothy and all of you engaged in a dialogue that historians have been having up to 10 years ago, when it was passé and, you know, it was time to move on. Of course, history is a constructed narrative. Whoever thought it wasn't? Of course, history is not a photograph of the past. The past is gone. It's evanescent. It's done. We have to reconstruct a narrative of a past through the detritus that's left behind. And we're not going to get it right. And every one of us who writes about the Civil War or the Spanish-American War or the Atlantic or any other subject is doing a history, just as we write a life. So, yeah, I mean, all history invokes a form of literary imagination, the historical imagination. All history is constructed. Yes, we choose what we're going to write about.
In that we're
but
talking
that doesn't mean that it's...
We're talking about this
Doesn't
so
mean that
often and so extensively these days, and have for the last decade or so, analyzing and reanalyzing the nature of biography. Do you think biographies are better, more, if you like, more fair today than they were, let's say, 50 years ago, when they were more hagiographical than analytical? Do you think we're getting better at the craft, and therefore is history benefiting from this, if we are?
Are we getting better at it? No, it's a different version. It's a different... I mean, nothing stays eternal. I mean, novels change, poetry changes, biography changes. And yes, I think that more... I would say the same thing about history. I mean, 50 years ago, there was a lot of history that...
Well, 50 years less of it than there is now.
Well, okay. But there was a lot of history writing.
Yes, yes.
Well said. There's a lot of history writing that I find fault with because the documentation wasn't there.
Right.
I would say the same thing about biography. I think why I was drawn to biography was that it is a good biography meets at the intersection of scholarship and literature. It's scholarship and it's literature. If it's not well written, it's not a good biography. If it can't be read for its own sake, you know, if it's not good biography. And if it doesn't represent something more than an individual life, if it doesn't use that life to talk about larger issues, if it doesn't use that life to talk about a specific time and place, if it doesn't use that life to talk about change over time, then I don't think it's good scholarship, and I don't think it's good biography either.
Well, when I was doing my, I guess, preliminary writing exercises for Hotel Florida, I made a timeline. It was a chronology of the war. And it went, I had every single month going across the top from 1936, July 1936, when the mutiny started, to April of 1939, when hostilities ceased. And then down the left-hand side of the page, I had every single character where is Jay Perini when I call them a character, every subject that I wrote about, and some others on the left-hand side, and I put in every single thing that happened. But the very first line across the top was the war and the world. I had to have the context, because if you didn't have that, you had nothing. There was no story.
Let me just add one thing, though, as a coda to what David is saying, and Amanda, too. Goes back to what you said, Simon, because I think it's important to underline something. Even I agree entirely with what's being said, but I think it's important to underline that just because history is a history or a constructed narrative, and the same can be said for biography, it does not mean that it's fiction. No. That's something else altogether. And so I don't want what David is saying to be misconstrued in that particular way. And I think there are many, many ways you can go at this particular question. One way that's fresh in my mind, I had just happened to read a very small book recently published here. It was published first in 1989 in France by a woman named Arlette Farge. It's called The Allure of the Archives. It was just translated and published in the United States. And Arlette Farge is a historian, and she's talking about how much fun it is for her, in many ways, to go to the archives as a historian. And toward the end of the book, very small book, she talks about the difference between writing history and writing fiction, because she too herself, as an eminent and very good historian and a wonderful writer, knows that history is a constructed narrative. She's at the archives creating her own archive from which she will write history. But she said the difference between history and fiction is that the world, and this is of course an extreme example, but for the sake of argument, the world of fiction is populated by the imagination of the author. And although history uses the imagination of the author, it has a responsibility to the people and the events and the ideas that were extant at the particular period of time that the historian or whomever is looking at. And it's a very different set of perhaps constraints and exhilarations at the same time, but it's not fiction. I just wanted to
in your research, and let's turn to you, David, about your research when you were doing the book on Kennedy. Was there anything that appeared in the archives or the documents you read which completely stunned you? I'm asking this of all of you because it'll enable me to tell a story of something that stunned me. But I want to hear from you first of all.
No, there was, any number of things. I was shocked at the anti-Semitic language that was used not only by Kennedy, but by, his comrades, his friends, his associates, in government, out of government, in Boston, in Washington, in London. I had a hint that some of it would be there, but it just hit me over the head. And then I was also, I could go on and on and on, I'll stop there. The reason one writes a biography, I think, and goes into the archives is to be surprised, is to be stunned. Right. If you think you know it all.
That's why I was thinking about the allure of the archive, because for me, and so anything that you can remember from your research?
One of the things that I was surprised, though perhaps not shocked or stunned by, was that, for instance, I gained access to the archives of Martha Gellhorn, who had written a very complete diary of her experiences in Spain. She then wrote up some of her experiences for various magazines for which she wrote, and then as time went on, she would tell stories about some of these experiences, and with each iteration, the story got more glamorous. Mm-hmm. She became pluckier and braver and more resourceful, and this myth grew up about her, which was not really successfully penetrated by her biographer, Caroline Moorhead, who had access to the same material that I had. But I went in there, and one of the things that absolutely stunned me was that there was this there's this legend about how Martha Gellhorn went to Spain just carrying a little backpack and a duffel bag and wearing a pair of trousers, and she took the train to a jumping off spot and then walked across the Pyrenees, some say, walked into Spain, says everyone else. Martha Gellhorn walked into Spain by taking a train to the end of the line where the gauge changes. She got out, walked across the tracks to the other side, and got on the train that's on the Spanish gauge. She didn't do those things that she said she did, and there's an awful lot more like that. I mean, it was not huge, grandiose fabrications of the Paul de Man sort, but it was surprising. And you know, you just see this stuff and you think, oh golly, you've got to go back to the archives because the stuff is there before she knew to sort of fudge it. There it is. She just wrote it down. This happened today. And that's when you want to get them. It's like I got the Robert Capa's film that had been recovered, that had been lost since 1940. And it was recovered in Mexico City, brought back to ICP here. And there were strips of film covering battles he'd been in, whatever, and you saw every frame, so you had this entire narrative that you couldn't even write that stuff down. He's just going click, 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 and you got 20 minutes of what happened to Capa. It was amazing. So that was incredible.
So one joyous and one disappointing discovery. Yeah. A profoundly disappointing discovery to find that Robert Kennedy was or rather Joseph. More anti-Semitic than you imagined.
Even than you had suspected.
How did this color your writing?
Well, you know, for a long time, I tried to figure out what it meant to be an anti-Semite. And I tried to figure out what was the right question to ask. And I realized everyone, including me, had been asking the wrong question. The wrong question was Joseph P. Kennedy an anti-Semite, but what kind of an anti-Semite was he? And given 1930s, 1940s Washington and London. And once you ask the question in that way, then things become much clearer. And then one is pulled towards making distinctions between anti-Semitic behavior and being an anti-Semite. Right. Lindbergh was an anti-Semite. Henry Ford is an anti-Semite. You know, Hitler and all his group, they're anti-Semite, and there are a lot of others. Kennedy, it is not his essence. He is not defined by his anti-Semitism, and yet he succumbs. He succumbs to anti-Semitic prejudices. He succumbs to the worst kind of, especially in the context of, from 1938 leading towards, he doesn't know there's a Holocaust coming. Nobody knows there's a Holocaust coming. But he knows that Jews are being persecuted. And yet, he has these anti-Semitic blinders that allow him to look past it. It's somebody else's tribe, you know.
Race is an important...
Yeah, I was just thinking about that.
I was thinking of the president who followed Lincoln, for instance.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to me because what David's saying about anti-Semitism, I think we're more forgiving of it than we are of race. Although the same standard of inquiry applies. What does that mean? What does the racism mean? What does it mean in its own time? What kind of a racist? And they're very discomforting answers, frankly. They're never good answers. Oh, this is a good racist, like a good anti-Semite, you know, in that particular way. But I think it's nonetheless, without moralizing, first, one is you have to ask the question because and when it comes to race in the 19th century, it's a broad spectrum, you know, and you can say everybody was racist, but then it doesn't, what have you said in that particular way? You haven't said much of anything, and then you have to sort of discriminate. Well, you know, was Nathaniel Hawthorne's the same racism as Stephen Douglas's racism? Was Lincoln's racism the same as Andrew Johnson's, you know, and the answer is no.
But how do you deal in your book, for instance, with Andrew Johnson?
Well, I mean, in one way it has
because he was a white supremacist, was he not, Johnson?
Oh, yeah, he was. he was. He was definitely an odious person, no matter how you slice him. You know, absolutely. And how you deal with him is basically dealing with the odious things that he did. I mean, I don't have to talk about him. I don't have to talk about his motives. I don't have to talk about his miserable childhood or his class anxiety and the fact that he was trying to, you know, pander to the, you know, white meritocracy in the South that had excluded him because he wasn't other. I don't have to talk about that. I have to talk about really what he did and didn't do to really stop Reconstruction from going in the way that certain others wanted it to go. And so that gave me a certain kind of freedom in that particular way. Why I would never want to write a biography of Andrew Johnson. I wouldn't have that kind of freedom because I would be honor bound to be, I think, more capacious than I had to be. But on the other hand, I think that someone like Stephen Douglas's racism is a fascinating issue because he changes and because Lincoln changes and people do change over time, which is also what you see. Sometimes their views change, sometimes their actions and not their views change. So I think that there's a lot that you deal with in these questions of, you know, moral outrage or whatever. I mean, one has to, one experiences it early in the book. I said, you know, I try not to, I don't presume to really indict people, you know, by my standards, because they were living in a certain time and place and they didn't have certain advantages that I do. On the other hand, doesn't mean I'm not without judgment and sympathy at the same time.
But that is the balance, isn't it, that a good biographer has to strike between an absolute moral outrage and the judgment of the day, the context, the time in which they were living, and the judgment of the time that you're living in.
Right, but I think, again, biographer or historian, I don't think there's anything wrong with judgment by any means either. I mean, I think it's one's duty, responsibility in a certain way, because there are certain kinds of things that were judged in their own time as well. So we participate in that. In some sense. So I'm not saying, you know, to withhold all judgment in that case either. But I'm saying that these are fascinating issues. They're really fascinating issues, and one can't be simple-minded or Manichaean or anything like that about them.
David, the three that we're focusing on under your authorship, Hearst, Carnegie, and Kennedy, I guess the most sympathetic of those three would be Andrew Carnegie. Was he therefore easier for you to write about than the two who if they were not monsters, they had monstrous aspects to their character?
No, I don't think, I couldn't write about somebody who I detested. I couldn't write if I thought about
Andrew Johnson.
Well, I couldn't write about Andrew Johnson. And, you know, and Dorothy is Dorothy here? She wrote a little book. I don't know if she had to spend 10 years with Lillian Hellman or write a big fat book, whether she could have done it. I couldn't do it. On the other hand, I don't have to like the person. What I have to do is to be fascinated, to be interested, to have questions, to be surprised, and to be able to understand something about a particular moment in time and a place by looking at this person's perspective or looking at that time and place from this person's perspective. If reading about Joseph P. Kennedy can tell me more about, and writing about him, can tell me more about the New Deal and more about Hollywood in the 20s and more about ethnic tribal politics and more about the run-up to World War II and Anglo-American relations, man, I'm off and running. Nothing can make me happier. And in all of my books, or the biographies, I'm looking beyond the person. It's great. Look, it's wonderful that Kennedy has this glamorous side, and that Carnegie was, 4'11", and never stopped talking, and that Hearst lived a bigamous life. But that's not enough for the biographer.
Except it is the hook, is it not? It's what gets the reader fascinated.
Well,
I did not know until you told me that. I'd always thought Andrew Carnegie was a giant of a man.
He was a dwarf.
I walk away from this meeting stunned.
I'm so sorry.
No, and delighted. But you're using these three characters in the same way that Amanda and Brenda are using their characters as a means of telling a bigger story.
Exactly.
Yes.
Do your way in.
Yeah, it's a way in. I wrote about, look, I don't think that, the biographer who just wants to write about the interior life, that doesn't interest me as a reader or as a writer. I mean, I wrote about Hearst because I wanted to understand media. I wrote about Hearst because everybody remember Ross Perot?
Oh,
Ross Perot was at the time, everybody said he was going to reconfigure American politics and get a third of the vote because he had a lot of money and he knew how to use the media. And I thought, what a great subject. Let me look at a man who had a lot of money, knew how to use the media, in fact, owned the media, and wanted to be president. And I can talk about politics and the media. Andrew Carnegie, I was going against the grain. My cohort of historians, my generation of historians, decided to write about the little people rather than the big people. History from the bottom up. And we all did that for a while. And I realized, hey, that's not the whole story. We've got to look at it from the top down as well. And I wanted to look at capitalism in its most glorious moment at the Industrial Revolution through the particular stories I could tell about Carnegie. And Kennedy was just a gold mine because telling the story of Kennedy, I could tell the story of the 20th century. I could go from World War I to World War II and the New Deal and the Depression and the New Frontier. I mean, with a man who had a front row seat and had things to say and knew movers and shakers, and yet was not on the inside. He was always on the inside and on the outside. He was on the outside looking in, and he was on the inside looking out. What a great perspective.
And that is such, I was going to say, I wanted to offer a slightly contrarian viewpoint here, but you just put your finger on something, which is I am interested in the context, and I want to get to the context, and the context is extraordinarily important. But I'm also equally, maybe even more interested in what the context does to the actors in it, and what happens to them, how history acts on the people, and the people who had gone to Spain to cover this war and had to deal with how honestly they reported it and how they ended up also having to deal with how honestly they lived and how honestly they dealt with each other. And it changed them in that way. So that was important and interesting to me, sort of the reverse, the obverse.
Yeah, you have to do both. Yeah, sure.
But
we're all creatures of history, and we're changed.
I mean, you must have felt
history.
that too, Brenda, no?
Oh, yeah, no, I was just thinking of something else, of two things. One was going back to the issue of race and how things, the outside changes. I mean, in some sense, the question of who gets the vote after the Civil War brought out some latent racist tendencies in a group of women that you would want to think of were above anything like that, and became quite racist in their decision to fight against enfranchising only black men. So it's interesting, that's a way in which context changes or brings out something. But I also was thinking in a very contrarian way to what David's saying, although I agree entirely. I also think I wouldn't be, I mean, for myself I'd be prescriptive, but I wouldn't be for anyone else. And that is to say that I think that there are biographies not histories, but biographies that are inside narratives almost entirely, that don't deal with the larger stage, that say intrigues the historian. And that would be, I'm thinking, I think this is right. Now, I haven't read it in a long time because I've been trying to think of an example. Lytton Strachey has a book on, not his eminent Victorians, but, well, because that's sort of interesting in its own right, but he has a book on Queen Victoria. And his book on Queen Victoria pushes against the whole idea of Victoria as part of the Victorian age, almost responsible for it. And she lives almost for the entirety of the 19th century, very much. So he doesn't do that. He basically gives you a story about what it is like, from his point of view, of course, to be Queen Victoria. Now, in strict biographical terms, it's not a biography in the sense that it gives you that broader panorama. On the other hand, he's a great writer, it's a great read, and it's very insightful. Whether it's true or not, it has a truth to it, and I would highly recommend it as a different kind, different way of approaching, say, a subject or even history. Strachey was pushing against the overpowering historical narratives of the 19th century. So,
but there is a difference, isn't there, between figures in history who are borne along by the tide of history and those who create the tide. I mean, I would say of your three, Hearst, hugely important in creating or interrupting the flow of history, whereas the others, Carnegie and Kennedy, were borne along on the surface of it. I don't know if you'd accept that as a premise. You wouldn't.
No, I wouldn't. I think we're all, look,
Yeah.
No, but Lincoln clearly was a man who changed history.
well, he said he was controlled. I mean,
But
he
he
was
would-
disingenuous.
say
He
that.
wouldn't have said that.
He would
said
as
was,
well.
And
He said he was controlled by events. He didn't control them.
Yeah.
I mean, that was. I mean, I don't know whether you take him at face value, but I think that there was a way in which he really believed that, and I think that to a certain extent there's a truth to that.
Well, and the biographer must make that judgment, must he and she not, that whether this person molds history or history molded them. Okay, in your three.
Well, I think we're all, look, it is the human predicament that we are born into a time and place, not of our own choosing. We are born into a culture and a society and a nation. We are educated in a certain way. The slate is pretty well filled by others until we get to the moment where we can think and act for ourselves. And yet we do think and act for ourselves. And that's true of the soldier in a war. It's true of the mother who raises a family in 1820s. It's true of all of us. I think if there's any truth, I've just talked down history from the bottom up, but if there is any truth to history from the bottom up, it's that it's not simply the great white men who make history. I mean, it's a variety of people, and it's the task of the historian and the task of the biographer to fine-tune, to describe that dialectic between what's given us and what we do with it. And that's what our lives are. We're given something, and then we do something with it. We move on.
In a way, and far less complicated, is history driven by events that humankind has nothing to do with. On the train today, I was reading, because I've got to review it for the Wall Street Journal, a new book on the eruption of the volcano Tambora in April 1815, which, in the view of the author, caused Irish immigration to America, caused cholera outbreaks in India, rebellions in Yunnan. I mean, it goes on and on and on, and not a single human being appears in the story at all. It's all about weather, and that we're, except, crucially, Shelley and Byron appear, because the weather was so atrocious during the winter of 1816 in Geneva, caused by the volcano, that the utterly miserable Mary Shelley sat down and wrote Frankenstein. So,
But you know, in your own book, in your own books, right? Answer the question from your own experience. nature or natural history does not predetermine human history. It influences it.
It influences
It
hugely.
influences it, but it doesn't predetermine it.
Unless you live in Pompeii.
You live in Pompeii. Okay, good. Right. Thank God we don't.
Yeah, really.
I wanted to, because I asked you earlier, and if you'll indulge me for 2 minutes, the joy of the archive. When I was doing, and it's now quite a long time ago, 15 years ago, a research into the life of W.C. Minor, the lunatic who worked on the OED, I knew that his work rate for the dictionary diminished savagely in 1902, 1903, but no one could tell me why. And then there was this incredible moment in the archives at Broadmoor Lunatic Asylum, page after page of medical reports, and finally, one page, handwritten in pencil, a guard at the asylum saying, Dr. Minor came to me at the front gate this morning saying, quick, quick, help me, I've just cut off my penis and thrown it in the fire. I think I'm bleeding to death.
Okay.
And
Wow.
that would clearly make your eyes sting, there's no doubt about that. You could certainly see why that interrupted his work on the dictionary. And I remember picking up
what the problem
that piece of paper.
You think?
Your private place to write a dictionary.
Well, he was a very clever man.
Yeah.
And I remember almost skipping with delight holding this piece of paper.
Yeah.
I found it,
I know.
you know,
Terrible.
Eureka. And then I went up to Oxford. The asylum was in Berkshire. I went up to Oxford that evening and told all the lexicographers, I said, we now know why W.C. Minor, and I related this thing to them. And then, please, I won't bore you for much longer. That evening I got on the train to go down to London, and there were two elderly lady lexicographers who had not been in the room when I exulted in finding this document. And the railway carriage was an open plan with lots of businessmen having been up to Oxford selling cars or something all day. And I said to these two old ladies, I've got an amazing story to tell you. And so I related, by now I had got all the details about how he'd used the same knife that he had cut the 3x5 cards. And he had honed it on a whetstone. He had used a piece of string as all the rest of it, because he knew how to, and lopped it off with one blow. And every man in the railway carriage crossed his legs. But these two old ladies looked at me with a fascinated and totally imperturbable expression. You could see the sort of lexicographical gears turning in their head. And then finally one of them said to me, autopiotomy. And I said, I beg your pardon. And she said, well, piotomy is the amputation of the penis. Autopiotomy is doing it yourself. And I believe that is a neologism, Mr. Winchester. If you can include it in your book, it'll be in the third edition of the OED. So, joy of archives.
That's joy. Oh, that's great.
I'm still fascinated. I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm totally off subject, although it wasn't.
No.
On this idea of not really, except for the lady in the earlier panel, not really being able to write about someone you dislike profoundly. I mean, you could have told the story of the 20th century through Hitler, as Alan Bullock did so brilliantly with Hitler, A Study in Tyranny. What is it, do you think, is different about your attitude and Alan Bullock, both great historians? He can write about someone who's utterly abhorrent.
Well, yeah, I mean, Ian Kershaw, I think.
Kershaw, too, yeah.
I mean, those three, he wrote 3 volumes,
Yes.
didn't he?
Oh, yeah.
2, 3, and they're absolutely brilliant. No, it's just personal choice. If I'm going to spend, if I'm going to spend 6 to 8 years with somebody, I don't want it to be someone I detest, number one. Number two, as a historian, I try not to deal in theological terms. I try not to make judgments of good and evil. I try not to be judge and jury. And with someone really detestable, with Goebbels or Hitler, it would be difficult, to stay away from notions of evil. It would be difficult to stay away from having a judgment, a moral judgment, sort of color the book from beginning to end. I have the utmost respect for people who can do it. I think Kershaw's book is just an absolutely extraordinary book, because he can suspend moral judgment and write about the making of a monster with an emphasis on the making rather than the monster.
You sort of have to be a clinician almost to do
don't
that.
you?
And I
Could you do it?
no, I couldn't. Well, I wouldn't want to live with them. That's the thing. You're really with your subject or subjects all the time.
I've always thought that, I mean, now the prospect of trouble in the Balkans is rising again with, you know, after what's happened in the Ukraine, and we're going to get Lithuania looked at, and now Serbia is starting to get nationalistically minded yet again. I've always thought that one of the most evil people in the 20th century was Ante Pavelic, who was the ruler of Croatia. And the relationship between him and the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope of the time, and the forced conversion of people before they were executed. There's never been a biography. I think people find him so universally, they find him so appalling.
Could you write that biography?
No, and that's why I'm interested in your view. I don't think I would want to live with him for
But
the
it's
months or
important
years.
that people do.
Yeah.
But it is important,
Really
that's the
important
point.
that
Someone
people
should.
do.
Someone
But
should.
just not
Raises
me.
the right questions and
That
find.
particular story, I don't mean to interrupt, is so important because of the complicity of the Vatican.
Well, exactly. There were so many interesting questions, even the one that David raised at table, the theological question of what is evil?
Yeah.
You know, what kinds of actions constitute that, and how do people that we would deem in that way or we find so repellent, how do they justify their actions to themselves, you know? And I think that's instructive historically and morally and in all kinds of ways. But so, as I said, fortunately, some people can do that and do it and do it brilliantly,
Like
as
Ian
in the case
Kershaw
of,
did.
absolutely. Or do it in novels, too. I mean,
Well, that's another way of doing it, isn't it?
That's
Yes.
exactly right. I think that's an important way to do that, too.
Yeah, I think the best biography of John Brown is Russell Banks's
Oh, yeah.
novel on
Amazing book.
the youngest child. Is it
It's
John Brown's
auto,
age?
yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Or the next to the youngest or the
Yeah.
youngest? I mean, because that's a subject, you know, I wouldn't know how to approach a character as complex, morally
As
complex
Brown.
as someone like John Brown.
And difficult.
And difficult, yeah.
Difficult. Yeah.
I know what your answer will be to this question, but I just open up briefly a line of questioning. Is your job ever done? I mean, you haven't written the definitive book on either of these three characters, have you?
No.
And you might, Amanda, however, say that you've probably written all there is to be written on the Hotel Florida.
Oh, well, I know. I'm sure someone else will come along and write something about the hotel itself that I really wasn't able or interested in doing because, in a way, it was a metaphor or actually it was a metonymy or a synecdoche or one of those things.
It's a conceit.
But I certainly haven't written not the first, second, third, or last word on the Spanish Civil War. There have been
Or on
some
Hemingway.
oceans of ink spilled on this subject and will continue to be, or on Hemingway, or on, I think, Martha Gellhorn, or on Robert Capa, or on Gerda Taro, or really even on Barea, who deserves to be written about and hasn't been formally in a big way. But he's a really interesting writer. He wrote a big, huge 3-part autobiography, which is incredible. I have read it only in English. It is apparently spectacular also in Spanish, but my Spanish isn't quite up to all of that. And he did translate it with his wife, so I felt like I was reading something that was authorized. But it's, no, I haven't finished. There's no way you could write a definitive book about this.
No, except, and the reason I'm asking this question is, when confronted by Robert Caro's biography of Johnson.
Oh, well,
Oh, well, exactly, and that's my point.
forget about it.
Forget about it, yes, I'm sorry, I'm still not American enough to use that phrase. So long, so exhaustive, so comprehensive. Might you say that he's done it and there's no need for anyone else to do it.
On Johnson?
On Johnson.
Or, well,
On Johnson.
there are other people who have done it or
I
are
know,
doing
but
it.
already have.
Yeah.
but not are doing
The
it
answer
now.
is
Yeah.
the answer is no. I don't think. I mean, other people will write about Johnson. There is no such thing as a definitive biography.
Right.
Michael Burlingame wrote. I was
Lincoln, right?
2,000 pages.
Yeah, and there's a 3-volume book, a 3-volume Lincoln that's coming out this year and next year.
Well, what
and
was
there's 10
Sandberg's?
volumes on Nicolay and Hay were 10 volumes.
And
look at
Sandberg-
Taylor
I think, was
Branch's.
four.
Sandberg
Look
had-
at Martin
4
Luther
or
King,
5.
3 volumes on Martin Luther King, and it's still, there'll be other books
no.
written on that.
There is an insatiable need to write or an
No, but also-
insatiable need to read.
Yes, but also, I mean, Emerson once said, and it's a nice little quote, I don't mean to be tendentious, but Emerson said, each age writes its own
Yes.
history.
Yes.
And each age writes its own biography is a consequence, because, as David said earlier, different documents come to light. As Amanda's been suggesting, she's bringing, a certain perspective onto her subject. You certainly brought a certain perspective. I can't say the auto whatever word to you. No, but you see what I'm saying in that particular way.
Yeah.
So the combination of each age and the writer and the different documents, of course, it's not going to be definitive. But who's looking for definitive?
Right. Well, we
mean,
all write. Yeah.
Different, you'd want different.
Emerson got it right.
Well, when Susan was saying earlier about how everybody plagiarizes everybody else, I was thinking, no. And in fact, interestingly, one of her former husbands, Calvin Tompkins, who wrote a wonderful short book about Gerald and Sarah Murphy, gave me his tapes that he had made of the Murphys talking, because they were dead and I was working on this big book about them and I certainly couldn't interview them. So he let me have all of this material, and he said to me later, you found material in there that I didn't even know was there. And that's just because I was writing 20 years after he was, and I was looking at it through different eyes. Everybody sees something different in something. And, so again, you're not plagiarizing that person, you're taking, and I certainly gave him credit, but, you're seeing something different.
Also another thing about the archives and research that should be said too, is that that's an act of imagination, and different people will bring different imaginations to how they go about research, which will yield different results too, I think.
It's
So,
also the nature of time and the nature of history. I mean,
Okay.
when you look, if I'm going to look at, I used to use this example with my students at Staten Island, which was like one building surrounded by parking lots. It's no longer there, Staten Island
the
Community
building
College.
or the park?
Nothing's there. I don't know what it is now. But I would say, if you go downstairs and look at the parking lot and describe it, you're going to see things up close. If you go up to the 4th floor of the building and look out, you're going to see not the individual detail, but you're going to see a larger configuration. If you go up on the roof, if you go up in a helicopter, if you go up in a satellite, you see a different view. One view is not more truthful than the others. And as we recede in time from that moment that we're talking about, we have different questions, we have a different perspective, we have a different view. And that's part of the nature. I mean, if you're going to be a biographer or historian, you're not going to write, you can maybe write a perfect poem, right? Or a perfect sonnet, or a perfect sonata. But I can't write, and none of us can write, I don't think, the perfect history that will stand for eternity. History is written to be rewritten. Biographies are written to be rewritten.
We have about 5 minutes left, and so I thought I'd throw it open maybe to the audience. See if anyone would like to. Gentleman there.
Come down and use the microphones.
If that's all right with you, I hope it is.
Yes.
There's archives in the record, and then there's your deductions. How certain do you need to be before you decide to treat your deductions as fact?
David.
I don't, I don't like to talk about facts. Facts are invented. Facts are created. Facts are constructed. I mean, if the post-modernism has brought anything to the historian, it's that. So when I make a deduction, I do the best I possibly can, to get it right, with no certainty whatsoever that I got it right.
My guru in all things related to getting it right is Jan Morris, formerly James Morris, who said that in matters like this, what you strive for is fairness.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important thing always to remember. I mean, you have, this is about the Spanish Civil War, taped on the top of your computer. I think we all should have, above all, be fair. I hope you'd all agree, or maybe it's too sappy.
No.
Sir.
Professor Nasaw referred to The Cloudspitter as a historical novel, and more people read historical novels, unfortunately, than histories and biographies, I think, although that's just an impression. Do you think they do harm by fictionalizing the events and the people, like Wolf Hall? I mean, she wasn't there. They make up dialogue, they make up facts to make a nice story. They fill in holes where there's no historical record. But then those movies, the historical novels, are the ones that get made into movies, and are so vivid and implanted on people's minds that they're really distorting history and the lives of the people who they're talking about. And I just wondered if any or all of the panelists had a view on that.
Brenda, why don't I put this one to you?
All right. I have no problem with historical fiction. Historical fiction is labeled historical fiction. It's fiction, and one takes it that way. I think we judge novels in particular, and hopefully, but not entirely, movies on aesthetic grounds. If it works, Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies, I think, work as novels, and I think they illuminate something that we may not have gotten, or they may bring us back to history itself. I mean, there is a downside. I see it more in movies. Somebody was just telling me, a journalist, a very good journalist, was saying that he was talking to a group of people about, he was doing some work on the mafia, and the people were telling him that certain groups, mafia organizations, didn't want to get into the heroin trade, so they got into prostitution, whatever it was. And the information, when he probed it and did his own analysis, turned out to come from The Godfather. Well, what are you going to do? I mean, you can't police how people read or the deductions they make. I mean, I'm always annoyed when Oliver Stone tells me what my life was like at a certain particular time, but that's the way it goes. I think those things are labeled. We weren't talking about movies, but fiction. I think it's fine. Tolstoy writes historical fiction. Who would want to say, oh no, you shouldn't do that? So I don't think I think it's healthy that there are all these genres.
And of course, the glib definition of what we do and what novelists do is that a novel is a work of creation, and what we're doing is a work of recreation, is it not?
Yeah. Never heard that before.
Well, I actually would call it reconstruction.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
And I really feel that's what we're trying to do, is to reconstruct what happened as much as we possibly can. And you just have to, what was the point? Oh, the wonderful flower on the other side of the border. What would happen if I had a moment like that when I was writing this book, and I was riding along, and I wanted to get Robert Capa to the battlefield on Verdun, where he was going to go and photograph a peace demonstration. And for about 1 second, I had this notion that he would take a taxi cab from the station through the fields that were still pockmarked by the war. And I thought, just a goddamn minute. Where are you going with this? No, you may not ever, 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 ever do that. And I stopped myself. So. But when you're trying to reconstruct things, sometimes, the temptation might be there, and you have to be very vigilant not to do that, I think. Particularly if you're writing very narrative material, which I was doing in this book in ways that I had not done before.
Well, shame on Martha Gellhorn for saying
Yeah,
she
well, that
walked
was
across
it.
the
You see,
Pyrenees.
it was catching.
Yes, yes.
It was terribly catching.
Infected by Gellhornitis. Yes. Well, a tour de force. Brenda, David, Amanda, thank you all.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.